If you sit down to read the book of Isaiah from beginning to end, you will eventually experience a kind of literary whiplash. It usually happens right at chapter 40. For 39 chapters, you have been walking through a relentless storm. You have read about collapsing empires and corrupt kings. You have seen visions of great cities turned to rubble and wealthy vineyards overgrown with thorns. You have heard the prophet deliver some of the most terrifying warnings in all of ancient literature. In the first half of the book, God's judgment is described with heavy, violent imagery. It is an unquenchable fire. It is an axe swinging at the roots of tall trees. It is a sweeping flood that rises to the neck. It is overwhelming. And then, suddenly, the storm stops. Without warning, the tone of the book completely flips. Chapter 40 opens with a voice crying out softly, "Comfort, comfort my people. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem. Tell her that her hard service has been completed." Suddenly, the poetry is filled with blooming deserts, leveling valleys, gentle shepherds, and a straight highway through the wilderness. The axe is gone. The heavy flood has receded. The dark clouds have broken. It is one of the most jarring transitions in the entire biblical library. The shift in tone is so extreme that for centuries, many readers have felt like they are holding two completely different books, written by two entirely different versions of God. The God of chapters 1 through 39 seems angry, destructive, and eager to tear down everything human hands have built. The God of chapters 40 through 66 seems gentle, merciful, and eager to heal. Most people read Isaiah and try to keep these two images apart. We naturally gravitate toward the comfort and quietly skip over the fire. We love the imagery of the gentle shepherd gathering the lambs in his arms. We are deeply uncomfortable with the heavy axe cutting down the forest. We assume that judgment and hope are opposites. We tend to think of them as competing forces in the heart of God. We assume that God must turn off his justice in order to turn on his mercy. We read the judgment sections as if God has lost his temper, and the hope sections as if he has finally calmed down. But what if that assumption is entirely wrong? What if we have misunderstood how this massive, complex book actually works? If you look closely at the text of Isaiah, reading it not as a random collection of disjointed prophecies, but as a unified vision, a brilliant and terrifying pattern begins to emerge. The words and images used to describe God's devastation in the first half of the book do not simply disappear in the second half. They are deliberately connected. Isaiah is an architectural masterpiece, and at the center of that masterpiece is a profound theological revelation. God's judgment and God's hope are not opposites. They are not two different moods. They are the exact same process, seen from two different sides. The judgment in Isaiah is never merely destructive. It is deeply purposeful. The judgment is the very fire that clears the ground for a new creation. The breaking down is the severe mercy required to prepare the soil for something that will last forever. Once you see this pattern, you can never unsee it. It changes the way you read every harsh warning in the text. It reveals that God is never just punishing his people. He is purifying them. But to see how this unified process actually works, we have to look closely at the primary weapon God uses in the first few chapters. We have to look at the fire, because the fire in Isaiah does two completely different things, depending on what it touches. If you read the opening chapters of Isaiah, you are immediately confronted with fire. It is everywhere. In Isaiah chapter 1, the nation of Israel is described as a rebellious people who have abandoned God. They have filled Jerusalem with corruption, violence, and injustice. They have turned to other gods, worshiping under sacred oak trees and in special gardens. And so, God speaks a terrifying warning. He says that those oak trees will fade, those gardens will go dry, and the corrupt leaders will become like dry tinder, and their work like a spark. Both will burn together, and no one will put out the fire. It is an image of total, consuming destruction. If you stop reading there, the message seems simple. God is angry, and his judgment is a fire that burns the wicked to ash. But if you keep reading just 3 chapters later, something strange happens. In Isaiah chapter 4, the fire returns. But this time, it is doing something completely different. Isaiah looks past the coming destruction and sees a future day when Jerusalem has been restored. He says that in that day, God will wash away the filth of the city, but he does not wash it with water. The text says, "He washes it with a spirit of judgment and a spirit of fire." And then, over the homes of the survivors, God will create a cloud of smoke by day and the glowing heat of a flaming fire by night. The fire will become a canopy, a shelter, a place of refuge from the storm. Notice what just happened. In chapter 1, the fire is a terrifying force that consumes the corrupt. In chapter 4, the fire is a washing agent that cleanses the city and a warm canopy that protects the people. How can the fire be both a weapon of destruction and a blanket of protection? Most people assume these are two completely different fires. We tend to separate the fiery wrath of God from the warming presence of God. But in Isaiah, it is the exact same fire. The difference is not the fire. The difference is what the fire touches. When the fire of God's holy presence touches pride, violence, and corruption, it acts as a consuming blaze. It burns away everything that is false. It reduces the dry wood of human arrogance to ashes. But when that exact same fire touches humility and repentance, it acts as a refining heat. It melts away the impurities. It protects. It illuminates. Isaiah actually says this directly at the end of chapter 1. God says, "I will turn my hand against you. I will thoroughly purge away your dross and remove all your impurities." Dross is the waste material mixed into raw silver or gold. The only way to remove it is to put the metal into a furnace. The fire is not sent to destroy the silver. The fire is sent to save the silver by burning away the dross. This changes the way we read the heavy judgment in the book of Isaiah. The terrifying warnings are not the explosive outbursts of a God who has lost his temper. They are the calculated, necessary heat of a refiner's furnace. God is not burning down the house because he hates it. He is burning out the infection because he wants to save the patient. The judgment is the purification. But understanding this as a theological concept is one thing. Watching it happen is another. To see the painful, heartbreaking reality of how God actually dismantles corruption, we have to look closely at a poem hidden in the 5th chapter. It begins as a beautiful love song, a song about a man, a hill, and a carefully planted vineyard. Isaiah chapter 5 begins with a song. If you were standing in the ancient crowds listening to the prophet, it would have sounded like a traditional folk ballad, or perhaps a love song sung at a harvest festival. Isaiah sings about someone he loves, who planted a vineyard on a fertile hillside. The song describes the careful, exhausting work of the gardener. He digs up the soil, he clears away every stone, he plants the absolute best, most expensive vines. He builds a watchtower in the middle of the vineyard to protect it, and he carves out a winepress in the rock, anticipating a rich harvest. He does everything right. He provides everything the vineyard needs to thrive. And then, he waits. But when the time for the harvest comes, the vineyard does not produce good fruit. The text says it produces wild grapes. But the English translation is almost too polite. The Hebrew word used here carries the idea of something foul, sour, or rotting. These are not just uncultivated grapes. They are bitter. They are toxic. They are entirely useless for making wine. At this point in the song, the tone shifts. The owner of the vineyard turns to the audience. He asks the people of Jerusalem to judge the situation. What more could he have done? He provided the soil, the seed, the protection, and the care. Because the vineyard only produces poison, the owner makes a devastating decision. He announces that he will take away its protective hedge. He will break down its stone wall. He will let it be trampled and overgrown with briars and thorns. He will even command the clouds to stop raining on it. And then, Isaiah drops the metaphor. He looks directly at the people and tells them that the vineyard is the house of Israel. The carefully planted vines are the people of Judah. Isaiah uses a brilliant, devastating play on words to explain exactly what went wrong. He says God looked for justice, the Hebrew word is mishpat, but instead, he saw bloodshed, mispach. He looked for righteousness, tzedakah, but instead, he heard the cries of the oppressed, tzedakah. From a distance, the nation looked healthy, but up close, the fruit was rotten. And so, the protective wall must come down. This is exactly what the judgment of God looks like in the first half of Isaiah. It is the removal of protection. It is the breaking down of a system that was supposed to produce life, but instead produced violence and oppression. Most readers look at the torn-down wall and the overgrown thorns and assume this is the end of the story. They assume God has finally given up. They read the destruction of the vineyard as a permanent rejection. But remember the pattern. God does not tear down the wall in a blind rage. He dismantles it because the structure itself has become corrupt. The vineyard is not producing justice. It is producing pain. To leave the wall standing would be to protect the poison. The dismantling is severe. It is painful. It involves invading armies, political collapse, and exile. But it is not the end of God's work. It is the clearing of the ground. At the end of chapter 5, the vineyard is completely desolate. The fire has burned the thorns. The walls are rubble. The land is dark. It feels like the final word has been spoken, but it has not. Because in the very next chapter, the year that a king dies, Isaiah is pulled into a vision of the throne room of God. He experiences this terrifying, purifying fire for himself. And when the vision is over, God gives Isaiah a message about what will be left after the fire sweeps through the land. He tells him that the destruction will be massive. The forest will be cut down. But in the middle of the wasteland, one specific object will remain. Isaiah chapter 6 is one of the most famous passages in the Bible, but it is almost always read entirely out of context. We usually read it as a standalone story about a prophet receiving his calling, but you have to remember the terrifying moment that just happened in chapter 5. The protective wall of the vineyard has been torn down. The beloved city is about to be overgrown by briars and thorns. The nation is facing total collapse. And it is in that exact moment, the year King Uzziah dies, the year the political stability of Judah shatters, that Isaiah is pulled into a vision of the temple. He sees the Lord sitting on a throne, high and exalted. He sees angelic beings calling out to one another. He feels the doorposts shaking, and he sees the room filling with smoke. Once again, we are introduced to the fire of God's presence, and Isaiah is terrified. He knows he is a man of unclean lips, living among a people of unclean lips. He expects this holy fire to consume him, just like the dry tinder of chapter 1. But notice what happens. An angel takes a burning coal from the altar. He touches it to Isaiah's lips. The fire does not destroy the prophet. It burns away his impurity. It removes his guilt. For Isaiah, the fire is the purification. And immediately after Isaiah is purified by this fire, God gives him a devastating assignment. God tells him to go back to the people of Judah and deliver a message of warning. Isaiah asks how long he must preach this heavy message. God's answer sounds like an absolute ending. He says to preach until the cities lie in ruin and without inhabitant, until the houses are left deserted, until the fields are ruined and ravaged, until the Lord has sent everyone far away and the land is utterly forsaken. It sounds like God has finally decided to wipe the slate completely clean. But the very last sentence of Isaiah chapter 6 holds the secret to the entire book. God gives Isaiah a final image. He says that even if only a fraction of the people remain in the land, they will be laid waste. But just as a massive terebinth or an oak tree leaves a stump when it is cut down, so the holy seed will be the stump in the land. Pause for a second and look at that image. A towering tree is chopped down. The branches are stripped. The trunk is hauled away. The brush is burned with fire. The landscape looks completely desolate. The judgment has fallen, but there is a stump left in the ground. And inside that seemingly dead stump, below the charred bark, there is a holy seed. There is life. This changes the entire theology of Isaiah. The judgment of God is an axe swinging at the roots of corruption. The fire of God is burning away the dead wood of violence and idolatry. The destruction is terrifying. It is comprehensive. But it is not final. God is not cutting down the tree to destroy the forest forever. He is cutting down the tree because the branches have grown toxic, and the only way to save the life of the tree is to bring it all the way down to the stump. The towering cedars of human pride have to fall. The sprawling branches of corrupt leadership have to be removed. The fire must clear the ground. The axe must remove the rot. But the holy seed remains. Judgment and hope are not two different paths. Judgment is the painful process of stripping away everything that threatens to kill the tree so that the holy seed can finally grow. But this raises a profound question. What exactly is this holy seed? What kind of life could possibly grow out of a burned and ruined stump? It takes a few more chapters of historical devastation, but the answer is coming, because in chapter 11, a tiny green shoot finally breaks through the ash. We left the story in the ruins of chapter 6. The towering trees had been cut down. The protective walls were gone. Only a scarred, burned stump remained in the desolate ground. It is a bleak image. In chapter 10, Isaiah explains exactly how this forest is going to fall. He describes the terrifying march of the Assyrian army. They were the most brutal empire of their day, sweeping across the map and swallowing nations whole. But Isaiah reveals something shocking. He says the Assyrian Empire is merely an axe in the hand of God. Listen to the violent, heavy poetry at the very end of chapter 10. Isaiah says the Lord Almighty will lop off the branches with great power. The lofty trees will be felled. The tall ones will be brought low. He will cut down the forest thickets with an iron axe. The royal house of Judah, the towering cedars of human pride, are coming crashing to the earth. The sound of the judgment is deafening. And then, chapter 11 begins. The transition is sudden. The dust of the falling forest has barely settled. The echoes of the iron axe are still ringing in the air. And right in the middle of the devastation, Isaiah says this: "A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots a branch will bear fruit." That detail is not random. It is the key to the entire history of Israel. Jesse was the father of King David. Centuries earlier, God had promised that David's royal line would sit on the throne forever. But over the generations, that royal family tree had grown corrupt. The kings of Judah had led the people into violence, idolatry, and oppression. The tree had become toxic. It was producing the wild, bitter grapes we saw in chapter 5. So God swung the axe. The historical collapse of Jerusalem and the end of the monarchy was the falling of the tree. To the people living through the invasion and the exile, it looked like God had abandoned his covenant. It looked like the royal line of David was dead forever. But God did not uproot the tree. He left the stump. He preserved the holy seed. And out of that dead-looking wood, a tiny, fragile green shoot breaks through the ash. Isaiah says, "The Spirit of the Lord will rest on this new shoot, the spirit of wisdom, understanding, counsel, and might." And notice what this new king does. Remember the rotten vineyard in chapter 5? God looked for justice, but found bloodshed. He looked for righteousness, but heard cries of pain. Now, look at how Isaiah describes the shoot of Jesse. He says, "With righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth." The new king produces the exact fruit the old vineyard failed to grow. The political disaster was not the end of God's plan. The political disaster was the painful removal of the corrupt leaders, making room for the true and final king. Pause for a second and see what has emerged. So far, this has not been a random set of scattered warnings. It is a carefully woven architecture. The fire burns the thorns. The axe removes the rot. The stump preserves the seed. And the shoot brings the messianic king. The judgment was never the opposite of hope. The judgment was the preparation for hope. But up to this point in the book, the atmosphere has been incredibly heavy. We have been sitting in the smoke and the rubble. The first 39 chapters of Isaiah are dominated by the swinging of the axe. But right at chapter 40, the script flips entirely. The heavy judgment is finished. The fire recedes. The tone shifts from terrifying warnings to breathtaking comfort. And the wasteland, created by the judgment, is about to become the site of a brand new exodus. For 39 chapters, the book of Isaiah has been a storm. The axe has swung. The fire has burned. The protective walls of the vineyard have been dismantled. The towering trees of human pride have been brought crashing to the ground. The city of Jerusalem has fallen, and the people have been carried away into the trauma of exile. They are sitting in the ashes of their own rebellion. And then, chapter 40 begins. There is no slow transition. There is no lingering warning. The heavy, violent poetry simply stops. The clouds break, and a voice speaks directly into the silence. "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem, and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for." This is the great turning point of the entire book. For decades, the prophets warned that the fire was coming. Now, the fire has passed, the purification has happened, and God's posture toward his people is no longer the posture of a judge tearing down a corrupt system. It is the posture of a rescuer rushing into the ruins. Isaiah hears a voice crying out in the wasteland. "In the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. To understand how beautiful this imagery is, you have to remember what the wilderness actually represents. In the first half of Isaiah, the wilderness was the punishment. It was what happened to the vineyard after the walls were torn down. It was the desolate, burned-out landscape left behind after the forest was chopped down. The wasteland was the visible evidence of their failure. But now, look at what God is doing. He does not bypass the wasteland. He does not build a road around it to avoid the mess. He commands a highway to be built straight through the middle of it. The wilderness is no longer a place of punishment. It is the birthplace of a new exodus. Centuries earlier, God led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt and brought them through the wilderness to the promised land. Now, Isaiah says God is going to do it again. But this time, the rescue is even greater, because God himself is coming down the highway. Isaiah says that the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all people will see it together. And when God arrives, he will not be carrying an iron axe. Listen to how Isaiah describes him now. He tends his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them close to his heart. He gently leads those that have young. This is the profound, beautiful tension of Isaiah. The God who swings the axe is the exact same God who gathers the lambs. The God who commands the fire is the God who carries the broken close to his heart. The severity and the tenderness are not a contradiction. They are the same holy love, acting in exactly the way required to save his people. The judgment cleared the corruption. The comfort restores the remnant. But this raises a massive theological question. God has announced the comfort. He has promised the highway. But how is this restoration actually going to be secured? Human hearts are still broken. The root of the corruption is still there. If God simply brings the people back to Jerusalem, what is to stop the cycle of rebellion from starting all over again? To fix the root of the human condition, the justice and the mercy of God have to perfectly collide. Someone has to absorb the judgment permanently. Someone has to step directly into the fire. And in the next section of the book, Isaiah introduces us to a figure who does exactly that. The book of Isaiah leaves us with a profound tension. God has promised to comfort his people. He has promised to build a highway through the wasteland. But the core problem remains. The human heart is still prone to rebellion. The root of the corruption that ruined the vineyard is still buried in the soil. If God simply ignores this, he is no longer just. But if he simply destroys it, he is no longer merciful. How does the holy God bring the corrupt people back into his presence without the fire of his holiness consuming them? In the second half of Isaiah, a mysterious figure steps onto the page to answer that exact question. Isaiah calls him the servant. At first, it seems like the servant is the entire nation of Israel. God calls Israel his servant, chosen to be a light to the world. But as the poetry continues, it becomes clear that the nation is too broken, too blind, and too deaf to fulfill the role. And so, the focus narrows. The servant becomes one specific, representative person who will do for the nation what the nation could not do for itself. And notice exactly how Isaiah introduces him in chapter 53. He says, "He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground." That is the exact same image we saw in chapter 11. The shoot of Jesse, the fragile life growing out of the burned, dead stump. Throughout the book, God has been cutting down the towering cedars of human pride. Now, the true king arrives, and he does not look like a towering cedar. He looks like a fragile root in a barren wasteland. But as you read the description of this servant, something shocking happens. He does not arrive as a conquering warrior swinging a sword to destroy his enemies. He arrives as a sacrifice. Isaiah says this servant is despised and rejected. He is a man of sorrows, familiar with suffering. And then, the heavy language of judgment from the first half of the book returns. But it is not falling on the corrupt nation. It is falling on him, Isaiah writes. We considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. For chapters, we have seen the devastating weight of God's justice, the invading armies, the torn down walls, the unquenchable fire. But here, the prophet says that the ultimate judgment is going to fall onto the shoulders of this one innocent servant. The toxic, bitter grapes produced by the corrupt vineyard, the bloodshed, the oppression, the violence are all gathered up and placed entirely on him. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. This is the theological center of the entire book. This is where the two halves of Isaiah finally collide. The terrifying judgment of the first 39 chapters and the breathtaking comfort of the final chapters meet in one single body. The servant steps directly into the fire. He takes the axe. He is, as Isaiah says, cut off from the land of the living. The tree is brought down. He absorbs the devastating judgment that the broken world deserved. But he does not just absorb it, he transforms it. Because he willingly takes the fire, he becomes the canopy of protection. Because he takes the punishment, he brings the peace. Because he is crushed, the people are healed. The servant takes the fire of chapter 1 and the hope of chapter 40 and binds them together in his own wounds. He is the holy seed. He is the one who goes into the ground, dies, and produces a harvest of life that will never rot. This is how the highway is built. Not with stones and dirt, but with the suffering of the servant king. But if the servant has absorbed the judgment and secured the comfort, where is this whole story heading? What is the final destination of this restored people? To answer that, Isaiah lifts his eyes past the historical city of Jerusalem and looks all the way to the end of the world. When the servant steps into the fire, the entire scope of the book begins to expand. Up to this point, the story has been intensely local. It has been about the physical city of Jerusalem. It has been about the historical collapse of a nation. It has been about the rescue of a specific group of exiles. But as you read the final chapters of Isaiah, the horizon suddenly pulls back. You begin to realize that the local history of Israel was only a fraction of the story. The judgment on Jerusalem was a microscopic picture of God's judgment on all human rebellion, and the comfort promised to the exiles was a preview of God's comfort for the entire cosmos. In chapters 65 and 66, Isaiah gives us a breathtaking vision of the end of history. He reveals that God is not just going to repair the old city, he is going to create a new heavens and a new earth. The language here is stunning. God says that the past troubles will be forgotten and hidden from his eyes. He promises to create a new Jerusalem, a city that will be a joy, and its people a delight. The sound of weeping and crying will be heard in it no more. But notice how Isaiah describes this new world. He uses the exact same images we have been tracking since the very beginning of the book. Think back to the ruined vineyard in chapter 5. The wall was broken down. The soil was cursed with briars and thorns. The harvest was nothing but bitter grapes, bloodshed, and violence. Now, look at the new creation in chapter 65. God says that in this new city, his people will build houses and dwell in them. They will plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They will not toil in vain or bear children doomed to misfortune. The curse of the broken vineyard is completely reversed. The ground finally produces life instead of death. But the most striking image is what happens to the violence. Since chapter 1, the world has been marked by bloodshed and oppression, the strong devouring the weak, the towering cedars crushing the fragile shoots, the Assyrian and Babylonian empires swallowing the vulnerable. But in the new creation, Isaiah says, the wolf and the lamb will feed together. The lion will eat straw like the ox. The predator and the prey will sit at the exact same table. The violence that infected the old world is completely gone. God says they will neither harm nor destroy on all his holy mountain. This is the ultimate comfort, but we have to be careful here. Isaiah does not end his book with a naive picture of universal happiness where justice no longer matters. Even in these final chapters, the fire returns. Isaiah makes it clear that the new creation is a reality for the humble, for those who tremble at God's word, and for those who are covered by the servant. But for those who cling to their pride, for those who refuse to let go of their violence and their idolatry, the fire of God's holiness remains a consuming judgment. The book ends with a stark, dividing line. There are two cities: the old city of human pride, which collapses into ash, and the new city of God, which stands forever. God does not force anyone into the new city, but he will not allow the violence of the old city to enter the new creation and ruin the vineyard a second time. The fire that protects the new Jerusalem is the same fire that consumes the rebellion outside its gates. And this brings us to the very end of the journey. When you pull back and look at the entire landscape of these 66 chapters, you are left with a profound realization about how God actually works in the world. If you step back and look at the massive, sprawling landscape of the book of Isaiah, the whiplash you felt at the very beginning finally makes sense. You no longer have to read this as two different books. You no longer have to choose between the God who swings the axe and the God who gathers the lambs. They are not competing ideas. They are a single, unified architecture of redemption. Look at the pattern one last time. The story begins with a vineyard that has grown toxic. It is producing the bitter grapes of violence, bloodshed, and oppression. Because God is holy, and because He actually loves the world, He cannot allow the poison to spread forever. So He sends the fire. He swings the axe. He allows the protective walls to be torn down. He allows the towering cedars of human pride to be chopped down to the roots. The judgment is severe, and the landscape is reduced to a wasteland. If you stop reading there, it looks like God has simply destroyed everything in a fit of rage. But Isaiah forces us to look closer. Beneath the ash, in the middle of the ruined forest, there is a stump. And inside that stump is a holy seed. The destruction was not the end. The destruction was the severe mercy required to clear out the rot so the seed could finally grow. Out of that stump comes the shoot of Jesse. Out of the wasteland comes the servant. And the servant does what the nation could never do. He steps directly into the terrifying fire of God's holiness. He absorbs the judgment. He is crushed for the iniquities of the people. And because he takes the fire, he becomes the canopy of shelter for anyone who will stand under him. He builds the highway through the desert. He leads the exiles home. And he secures the new creation, where the wolf and the lamb finally feed together in perfect peace. This changes everything about how we read the heavy, difficult warnings of Scripture. We naturally want the comfort without the fire. We want the new creation without having to dismantle the old city. We want the healing without the surgery. But Isaiah tells us that God's justice and God's mercy are working together to accomplish the exact same goal: the removal of everything that destroys life and the preservation of everything that produces it. When God's judgment falls on the pride, the arrogance, and the violence of the world, or even the pride in our own hearts, it can feel terrifying. It can feel like the forest is falling. It can feel like the walls are coming down. But the fire of God is not sent to destroy the silver. The fire is sent to save the silver by burning away the dross. God brings down the towering trees of our own self-reliance because He knows that true life can only grow from a humble, dependent root. He allows the wilderness seasons not to abandon us, but to build a straight highway into our hearts. The book of Isaiah is not a random collection of ancient prophecies. It is a brilliant, terrifying, and ultimately beautiful revelation of how God saves the world. If this study has helped you see Scripture with fresh eyes, consider subscribing so you do not miss our next deep dive into the biblical text. We often read the prophets just looking for information about the future. But the vision of Isaiah was never just about predicting the future. It was the careful, quiet architecture of a God who will burn away everything false just to bring His children home.